All of a sudden, I just looked at him and I said, I don't know if I can find guys with the same faces and the same enthusiasm.
Whispers from old Hollywood are growing louder. Did John Wayne truly hate Clint Eastwood? For decades, the real reason was buried. But now, a forgotten script, a scathing letter, and a clash of egos pull back the curtain on a feud that rewrote the myth of the Wild West. And wait until you hear what Clint Eastwood did next. It changes everything. The rise of two Western icons. John Wayne and Clint Eastwood stand as towering figures in Western cinema, but from very different eras and philosophies. John Wayne wasn't just an actor, he was the embodiment of the cowboy. His gruff voice, commanding presence, and unwavering moral clarity made him more than a star. He was a symbol of courage, patriotism, and righteous masculinity. Films like Stagecoach and The Searchers cemented Wayne as a hero of post-war America, where his characters became moral compasses for millions. Then came Clint Eastwood, lean, quiet, and brooding. In the 1960s, he burst onto the scene with Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns. Unlike Wayne's noble cowboys, Eastwood's Man with No Name was cynical and driven by self-interest, profit, vengeance, and survival. He spat on traditional heroism and rode through a grimmer, dustier West. This was a revolution in style and attitude. The contrast couldn't be clearer. Wayne was the past, Eastwood the future. According to Far Out magazine, Wayne deeply resented this shift. He believed Westerns should be about clear heroes and villains, men fighting for law and liberty, not personal gain. Wayne lamented the growing cynicism he saw in the genre and felt Eastwood's characters undermined its dignity. This creative clash turned personal with Eastwood's 1973 film High Plains Drifter. The movie's dark, supernatural revenge tale shocked Wayne, who wrote Eastwood a furious letter accusing the film of dishonoring the pioneers who built the West. Eastwood, in a GQ interview, said he was stunned, but saw the film as a fable, not history. For Wayne, it was about responsibility protecting the sanctity of the Western hero. His fans saw those characters as extensions of the American dream. Yet Eastwood, who grew up admiring Wayne's work, wanted to evolve the genre. In a Diario S interview, Eastwood said Red River was the first Western he saw that showed a complex character, not just good or bad. The world had changed, he argued. Wars and social unrest made simple good versus evil stories feel dishonest. His characters were morally conflicted and emotionally reserved, reflecting that new reality. Their rift deepened in the 1970s when Eastwood offered Wayne a screenplay called The Hostiles, about a young gambler and an aging outlaw reluctantly teaming up. Eastwood saw it as a bridge between their generations, a tribute to Wayne, yet signaling change. Wayne's reaction? He scoffed and threw the script away. There would be no collaboration. Critics have speculated that Wayne saw Eastwood not just as a challenger, but as a threat to his legacy. The press eagerly fueled the rivalry, comparing their box office successes and styles. But the real divide was deeper. Wayne wanted to uphold Western values, while Eastwood sought to reveal their fragility. Wayne's heroes charged headfirst into conflict. Eastwood's emerged scarred and silent. Despite this, Wayne couldn't ignore Eastwood's rising influence. As Eastwood's fame grew, traditional Westerns like Wayne's faded. Studios preferred Eastwood's edgier style. Wayne's final film, The Shootist, in 1976, featured a dying gunslinger, an apt metaphor for the end of his era. Though they never publicly reconciled, Eastwood respected Wayne's legacy. His 1992 film, Unforgiven, was a farewell to the noble cowboy mythos, dissecting everything Wayne stood for, but doing so with reverence. As Eastwood once said, the Western was never about reality. It was about reflecting who we think we are. But what happens when the cowboy stops standing for honor and starts asking why he ever did? Come with us to know Diverging Philosophies on Western Storytelling. There was something sacred about the Western frontier in John Wayne's eyes, a place of clarity, of honor, of men who stood for something bigger than themselves. To him, the genre wasn't just entertainment, it was a hymn to American values. Each dusty showdown, each cowboy's creed was a lesson in right and wrong. His West was an open-air cathedral where moral certainty reigned and where every gunslinger knew what side of the line he stood on. Then Clint Eastwood walked in, silent, uninvited, and unwilling to say which side he was even on. Where Wayne's cowboys were blunt instruments of justice, Eastwood's were shadows smirking, brutal, unrepentant. Their arrival marked not just a shift in character, but in worldview. This wasn't just one man's grudge. It was a philosophical rebellion, written into film reels. In Eastwood's High Plains Drifter, the West isn't a land of heroes. It's hell on earth, a ghost town rotting from within. The so-called townsfolk are complicit in cowardice and cruelty, while Eastwood's mysterious strangers seems less like a savior and more like a reckoning. When the film was released, it split the genre in two. One half clung to Wayne's golden rules. The other looked into Eastwood's abyss and saw truth. John Wayne hated it, not disliked, hated. According to Far Out magazine, he wrote to Eastwood directly, furious at how the film portrayed pioneers not as builders of civilization, but as spineless parasites. He accused the story of defiling the mythos he had spent decades building, calling it anti-American in spirit. For Wayne, it wasn't just a script gone sour, it was an insult to the collective identity Westerns were meant to uphold. Eastwood, unfazed, brushed it off. It was allegorical, he said in interviews, not a documentary. In his mind, the West was never clean. He didn't want to revere it, he wanted to interrogate it. To ask what kind of society needed violent men to begin with. In a rare sit-down on INSP TV's The Search for Justice in Westerns, Eastwood described his approach as replacing mythology with psychology. His cowboys didn't carry righteousness, they carried trauma, and audiences responded. By the late 1970s, Eastwood's morally ambiguous characters were resonating with a new generation disillusioned by Watergate, Vietnam, and social upheaval. Wayne's West, once pristine, started to feel nostalgic and outdated. The stark line between good and evil began to blur on movie screens. Wayne, meanwhile, didn't adapt. He refused to. He believed that to distort the Western was to chip away at the very foundation of American storytelling. In one of his final interviews with Playboy in 1979, he said, "We can't let the bums and the brutes become our heroes. If we do that, we lose everything." He wasn't just talking about film, he was talking about culture. But Eastwood was listening to the people, to the times, and he made films that reflected that tension. In Pale Rider and The Outlaw Josie Wales, justice came through blood and ambiguity, not lawmen or manifest destiny. These weren't films to inspire schoolchildren. They were cautionary tales for a nation at war with its past. What stings most in retrospect isn't that Wayne and Eastwood disagreed, it's that they were talking about two entirely different things. Wayne was telling stories to affirm identity. Eastwood was telling stories to question it. One of the starkest contrasts in their approach came through their treatment of towns. For Wayne, the Western town was a bastion of civilization, its sheriff, preacher, and saloon, all symbols of order. For Eastwood, the town was always complicit. In High Plains Drifter, the entire population is guilty of betrayal. Their peace is a lie, bought with silence. The hero, if he can be called that, doesn't restore order, he punishes it. Film critic Peter Bradshaw of The Guardian once remarked, "Wayne was telling the story of what we wished the West had been. Eastwood was telling the story of what it probably was." That difference, though subtle on paper, split the genre into two branches that rarely touched again. To their fans, the divide became spiritual. Wayne loyalists felt protective his West was pure, American, and full of honor. Eastwood fans called his films real, nuanced, necessary. It was like watching a steel monument rust in real time, beautiful and painful. Despite all this, the two never squared off publicly. Wayne never took shots in the press. Eastwood never threw shade in interviews. They understood something bigger was at play. They weren't just making films, they were arguing about America. And in a strange, poetic way, they both won. What kind of story unfolds when two legends see the same frontier through completely different eyes? Let us tell you. The unmade collaboration, The Hostiles. There was a moment in Hollywood history, brief, flickering, and ultimately extinguished, when two titans of the Western genre nearly shared the screen. Clint Eastwood, the stoic gunslinger of a grimmer frontier, reached across decades to John Wayne, the embodiment of old-school Western valor. His hope? A collaboration that would have sent seismic waves through cinema, a joint venture in a film titled The Hostiles. The story behind The Hostiles doesn't begin on a dusty set or in a boardroom. It begins with a gesture, a script, quietly slid into an envelope by Eastwood himself. The premise was simple, but ripe with dramatic tension. A young gambler and an aging outlaw, forced together by fate and circumstance, navigate treacherous terrain, both literal and moral. Eastwood would play the gambler. Wayne, the grizzled gunslinger clinging to dignity. It was a metaphor in motion. The New West meeting the Old. Eastwood believed it could work. He had grown up watching Wayne. He knew what the Duke represented, but he also knew the world had changed. Audiences were no longer looking for white-hat cowboys and sunset endings. They wanted grit. They wanted truth. The Hostiles wasn't meant to dethrone Wayne, it was meant to honor him in the only way Eastwood knew how, by pushing the genre forward. But the Duke didn't see it that way. When the script reached Wayne, his response was swift and scathing. According to an article in Far Out magazine, Wayne didn't just dislike the script, he felt betrayed by it. To him, the film painted the West with cynicism. The sheriff was a brute. The townspeople were cowards. The moral compass spun wildly. Wayne believed it distorted everything the Western stood for. Worse, it distorted the ideals he had spent his entire career defending on screen. So he wrote back. In a now famous exchange documented by Slash Film, Wayne told Eastwood, the script wasn't just wrong, it was offensive. He accused Eastwood of crafting a version of the West that was not about the people who built it. It wasn't simply a script rejection, it was an ideological line in the sand. But Eastwood wasn't deterred. He believed in the story. And more than that, he believed in the symbolism of the collaboration. He made revisions, trying to balance the rawness with the reverence. He sent the revised draft back through Mike Wayne, the Duke's son, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this time, John Wayne would see the vision. He didn't. As Mike would later recount in interviews, they were on Wayne's boat when he handed him the script. The elder Wayne took one look at the title and tossed it overboard into the sea. That moment, almost theatrical in its finality, became legend. The message was clear. There would be no partnership. Not now, not ever. Cohen's original script, which Eastwood had optioned, would eventually limp to life years later as a low-budget Hallmark-style TV movie called The Gambler, the Girl, and The Gunslinger in 2009. According to the Clint Eastwood archive, it bore almost no resemblance to the gritty, character-driven story Eastwood once envisioned. The soul of the hostiles had long since drowned in the Pacific. What made the collapse of the hostiles so significant wasn't just the missed opportunity. It was what it revealed about the chasm between these two men. Eastwood saw the Western as a landscape for complexity. Wayne saw it as a temple for clarity. Eastwood wanted characters who questioned their place in the world. Wayne wanted ones who defined it. There was no reconciling those visions. In a quiet moment years later, Eastwood would speak reflectively about the failed project. He told GQ that he didn't blame Wayne. He was a product of a time that believed in good guys and bad guys. But that time was already gone. Eastwood had offered a bridge, but it was built on a foundation Wayne had no interest in crossing. In some ways, the hostiles became a symbol of transition, of tension, and of how two legends could admire one another from a distance but never walk the same road. They had different tools, different truths, and for all their similarities in boots and bravado, their Wests were built on opposite dreams. And so the film was never made. But the silence it left behind, that echoed for decades. But what deeper tensions lay beneath their failed collaboration, fueling a rivalry that went far beyond the silver screen? Stay with us to know. Personal and professional rivalries. There's a particular kind of tension that doesn't come from gunfights or galloping horses. Sometimes, the sharpest shootouts happen behind closed doors, with scripts instead of 6 shooters. And the real frontier is ego. When John Wayne and Clint Eastwood circled each other in Hollywood's narrow corridors, it wasn't just a clash of film philosophies, it was a collision of two vastly different worlds. Their paths crossed during a period when American culture itself was splitting in two. The late 60s and 70s weren't just turbulent, they were transformative. Movements were redefining identity, freedom, morality, and Hollywood, always a mirror to the times, was feeling the fracture. John Wayne didn't bend to that tide. He stood firm, unmoved, even defiant. Eastwood, however, listened. He absorbed the confusion of the age and folded it into his characters, the haunted, morally gray men who couldn't tell you if they were heroes or not. In interviews resurfaced by INSP TV and Far Out magazine, Wayne expressed irritation over what he called the erosion of real American values in modern cinema. While he never named Eastwood directly in those criticisms, the implication hung thick in the air. Wayne's idea of a cowboy was built on honor and principle. Eastwood's cowboys looked like they hadn't slept in weeks, maybe slain someone the night before, and didn't lose any sleep over it. That wasn't a hero in Wayne's eyes, that was a warning. But it went deeper than cinema. Wayne saw Eastwood's rising popularity as a sign not just of changing tastes, but of being replaced. He had been the undisputed monarch of the Western for decades. Now, here came this stoic loner with a squint and a poncho, speaking less and earning more. The studios began shifting budgets. The media, too, took notice. GQ once ran a comparative piece titled "The Duke and the Drifter," breaking down their box office numbers, fan demographics, and even masculinity quotients. The unspoken question, who owns the West now? And then came the subtle jabs. According to archived columns from The Hollywood Reporter, Wayne allegedly turned down several projects that producers suggested might appeal to Eastwood's audience. He called them trash for cynics. He believed movies had a duty to uplift, to instruct, to protect moral clarity. Eastwood's films, with their brooding silences and existential dilemmas, felt like betrayals. Eastwood never retaliated openly. He didn't have to. He knew silence could be louder than words, but in rare moments, he let the mask slip. In a 1985 interview with Film Comment, Eastwood acknowledged the divide. "I admired Wayne for his presence, but I didn't buy the world he came from. My West was different. It had shadows." Behind the scenes, their rivalry was more than just personal. It had professional consequences. According to a detailed piece in Cinema Archive Quarterly, producers and directors often found themselves in awkward positions when trying to navigate between the two giants. Casting decisions were politically fraught. Endorsements for emerging westerns became declarations of allegiance. And the fans? They took sides. Wayne loyalists mailed angry letters to studios that funded Eastwood's darker westerns. Eastwood fans, younger and more jaded, mocked the old guard as obsolete. Entire college essays were written on the symbolism of the Eastwood-Wayne divide. One professor even taught a class at UCLA called "The Moral Landscape of the Modern Western," which revolved around comparing their legacies. Wayne never admitted envy, but friends close to him suspected it gnawed at him. As reported in a 1994 Vanity Fair retrospective, a close associate recalled, "Duke watched every Clint movie. He never said much, but you could see it bugged him, the way people worshipped Clint's silence, the same way they once worshipped his swagger." In contrast, Eastwood seemed at peace with the divide. In fact, he even seemed to mourn it. Years later, when speaking with El País, he admitted, "I wish we could have done something together. Not to merge styles, but to acknowledge the era change. But the bridge was never built." Wayne passed in 1979. Eastwood continued evolving. By the time Unforgiven rolled out in 1992, it felt like a eulogy not just for the cowboy, but for the kind Wayne had always played. A deeply reflective Eastwood once said to NPR, "You can't build a myth without first tearing it down. That's what I tried to do." Did Eastwood's High Plains Drifter unsettle Wayne because it dared to paint the West in shades of gray? A bold and unforgettable critique. It wasn't a press conference, a TV interview, or a backhanded comment in the media that signaled John Wayne's contempt for Clint Eastwood's vision. It was a letter. A letter scrawled in blunt ink and firm words, sent not as a gesture of collaboration, but as a line drawn in the sand. In the long and storied history of Hollywood rivalries, there are few moments as sharply defined as the day the Duke decided to sit down and confront Eastwood on paper. The film in question was High Plains Drifter. Released in 1973, the movie wasn't a traditional Western in any sense. It was brooding, violent, and unapologetically surreal, a ghost story in boots and dust. Eastwood directed and starred in it, and the film quickly gained attention for flipping the moral compass of the genre upside down. Wayne, upon viewing the film, didn't wait for an interview to air his grievances. According to a retrospective by Screen Rant, he took a more old-fashioned approach. He sent a private letter directly to Eastwood. The tone was critical, the message clear. Wayne believed the film insulted the memory of the American pioneer and defiled the spirit of the Western. It wasn't just creative critique. It was personal. "You're not telling the story of the people who built the West," Wayne allegedly wrote, as cited in Far Out magazine. "You're tearing it down." To him, High Plains Drifter wasn't art. It was sacrilege. Eastwood, by contrast, was taken aback but not shaken. In later interviews, including a conversation archived in Total Film, Eastwood admitted he hadn't expected Wayne to be so offended. "To me, it was a fable," Eastwood said. "A morality play, not a documentary." He saw his film as myth otherworldly, symbolic. But Wayne couldn't reconcile symbolism with perceived insult. What Eastwood may not have fully realized at the time was how deeply Wayne identified with the mythos of the Western frontier. It wasn't just a genre to Wayne, it was a belief system, a canvas on which American values had been painted in bold strokes for decades. Eastwood's brushwork, in contrast, was shadowed and impressionistic. Film scholar Linda Costanzo-Cahir noted in an essay for the Journal of Popular Film and Television that Wayne's worldview saw the Western as a sacred text of national character. Any revision of that narrative, especially one as dark and unapologetic as High Plains Drifter, wasn't just controversial. It was heresy. Wayne's letter was a rare act of confrontation in an industry that often operates behind veils. And while it was never released in full to the public, references to it have surfaced repeatedly. Clint Eastwood, ever the stoic, never published or quoted it in entirety, but he acknowledged its existence multiple times over the years. "He didn't like what I was doing," Eastwood told Empire magazine. "He thought I was taking a dump on everything he stood for. But I wasn't trying to insult him, I was just telling a different story." That story, an allegorical one about vengeance, complicity, and justice twisted beyond recognition, was everything Wayne couldn't stand. His cowboys were builders. Eastwood's were destroyers. His towns were the promise of order. Eastwood's towns were decay in disguise. It was more than a generational rift. It was a philosophical war waged through cinema. But what made the letter all the more poignant was the timing. By the early 1970s, Wayne's influence was waning, and Eastwood's was rising like a desert storm. Studios were more willing to gamble on grit than on honor. The anti-hero was replacing the sheriff. In that context, the letter read like a last stand, a final attempt to guard the gates of a genre that was slipping away from Wayne's grasp. Critics and historians often reflect on the letter as symbolic of the broader tension in American culture at the time. The optimism of the post-war era was cracking under the weight of Vietnam, Watergate, and a shifting national identity. In that cultural climate, Wayne's rugged idealism began to feel anachronistic, while Eastwood's cynicism felt disturbingly accurate. In one revealing interview from The Hollywood Reporter, Eastwood mentioned that he respected Wayne's courage to speak up. "He had convictions," Eastwood said. "I disagreed with most of them, but he wasn't hiding." That statement, quiet, restrained, showed Eastwood's trademark diplomacy. He never retaliated publicly. He never belittled Wayne's legacy. But he didn't change course either. Years later, Eastwood would say that High Plains Drifter was inspired as much by Western tropes as it was by Shakespearean ghost tales. It wasn't meant to deconstruct Wayne, it was meant to confront the myth of consequence. But in Wayne's eyes, it amounted to the same thing: a hero who punishes rather than saves. That was a world Wayne refused to enter. So the letter remained a stark reminder that even icons clash when values collide. It was not a declaration of war, nor a bridge toward compromise. It was, in every sense, a lament. Wayne, through his writing, expressed not just frustration, but sorrow. A sadness that the world he had helped build on screen and off was being torn down by the next generation of storytellers. Eastwood read the letter. He folded it. He filed it away, both literally and emotionally. He never brought it up without respect. But he never apologized for what High Plains Drifter represented. Because for Clint Eastwood, the West wasn't a moral playground, it was a mirror. And sometimes, the reflection isn't what legends want to see. Was Wayne simply reacting to a film, or was he defending a dying vision of the American West? John Wayne's battle to preserve the Western legacy. At the heart of the legendary feud between John Wayne and Clint Eastwood was something far deeper than professional rivalry or clashing egos. It was a battle over a legacy, one that John Wayne felt compelled to guard fiercely. For Wayne, the Western wasn't just a film genre. It was a sacred narrative, a cultural foundation built on ideals he held dear. Every role he played was part of a grander mission, to uphold the mythology of a brave, honorable, and unyielding America. This was the world he believed in, and he saw himself as its steadfast protector. Wayne's Westerns carried a clear message. There was right and wrong, good and evil, heroes and villains. His characters were paragons of virtue, rugged, honest men who defended justice no matter the cost. This vision, etched into the collective American psyche over decades, was more than entertainment. It was an idealized reflection of who Americans wanted to be. It symbolized courage, patriotism, and a moral certainty that many found comforting, especially during turbulent times. Enter Clint Eastwood, whose very approach threatened to unsettle that carefully crafted myth. Eastwood's films peeled back the veneer, revealing the West's rough edges shadows where morality wasn't clear, and heroes carried scars and doubts. Eastwood challenged the neat binaries Wayne championed, favoring ambiguity over absolutes, complexity over simplicity. His stories were darker, more cynical, and unwilling to gloss over the harsh realities beneath the legend. Wayne's reaction was rooted in this fundamental clash. He perceived Eastwood's revisionist narratives as an erosion of the very principles that defined the Western and, by extension, American identity itself. Protecting that legacy wasn't about artistic conservatism. It was a defense of the cultural and historical values he believed the nation needed to hold on to. To Wayne, Eastwood's portrayal was not just a different style. It was a direct threat to the moral fabric his films had long reinforced. In interviews and accounts from that era, close friends and collaborators describe Wayne as increasingly protective, almost territorial, over the Western genre. He saw the West not merely as a backdrop, but as a symbol of American virtue under siege. Any depiction that muddied those waters felt like a betrayal. Wayne's insistence on preserving a pure narrative wasn't nostalgic stubbornness. It was a conviction born from decades of witnessing social upheaval and cultural shifts. He feared that the harsh truths Eastwood presented could foster cynicism rather than hope. What made this battle particularly poignant was that Wayne wasn't simply dismissing Eastwood out of spite. Deep down, he recognized Eastwood's talent and influence. But the core issue remained. Eastwood's vision didn't fit into the narrative Wayne was sworn to uphold. This rift was more than personal. It was existential. The industry watched as this quiet conflict unfolded. Studios, critics, and audiences felt the tension, often framing it as a battle between traditional values and modern realism. Yet, those close to Wayne reveal that his motivation was less about resisting change and more about guarding what he believed was essential for the country's cultural soul. He feared losing the myth that had inspired so many, especially young people seeking role models in uncertain times. This struggle over the Western's identity ensured that Wayne and Eastwood's paths would never fully converge. Wayne's legacy remained tied to the heroic ideal unchallenged and dignified. Eastwood's legacy, meanwhile, pushed the genre into new, uncharted territory, questioning and reshaping the myths Wayne fought to preserve. If John Wayne's fury surprised you, hit that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and tap the cards for more untold Hollywood drama.